Late summer, 1945. The war is over, but the silence inside the American prisoner of war camp is heavy and strange. The razor wire trembles slightly in the warm breeze. Beyond it, pine trees sway under a pale sky. Rows of Japanese prisoners sit on low wooden benches, their khaki uniforms faded, their faces unreadable. Weeks ago, these men believed dying was more honorable than capture. Now they are alive, but stripped of rank, weapons, and purpose. A small group of U.S. guards approaches, boots crunching on the gravel path, in their hands, plain brown envelopes. They stop before the prisoners. No one speaks. One guard steps forward and calls a name from a crumpled list. A man rises hesitantly, bows stiffly, and accepts the envelope with both hands. Inside, a photograph. His wife in a summer kimono, a child he hasn't seen since birth. A small gasp escapes him, sharp and involuntary. His shoulders shake once, almost imperceptibly. Around him, others begin to open their envelopes, some clutching the paper to their chests, others staring wordlessly for the first time since their surrender. The sound of quiet weeping breaks the still air. It began not with politics or commands, but with photographs, returned across a battlefield's endless divide. In the early 1940s, the war in the Pacific was unlike anything the modern world had seen. It was vast, merciless, and fueled by two clashing visions of honor and survival. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, it did more than cripple the American Pacific Fleet. It set into motion a brutal struggle that would stretch from the jungles of Burma to the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima. Japanese military culture at that time was shaped by Bushidō, the centuries-old warrior code, emphasizing loyalty, self-sacrifice, and death before dishonor. Soldiers were taught that capture was shameful. Surrender meant abandoning the emperor and family. Manuals and training films hammered this message relentlessly. Better to die by one's own hand than live as a prisoner. As a result, Japanese troops fought to the last man in many campaigns. At Guadalcanal, Saipan, Peleliu, and Tarawa, entire garrisons refused to yield, even when hopelessly outnumbered and cut off. Civilians were also drawn into this ethos, families leaping from cliffs rather than submit, soldiers charging tanks with bayonets when ammunition ran dry. For American forces, this ferocity was terrifying and deeply alien. The war turned personal and bitter. Marines landing on Pacific beaches found opponents who would rather stage banzai charges at night than accept medical help. Capturing a live Japanese soldier became a rare event. The first prisoners taken often arrived gravely wounded or unconscious. Intelligence officers quickly realized how difficult it was to gather information, when almost no one would allow themselves to be captured alive. When prisoners were taken, their personal belongings, diaries, letters, family photographs were often seized for security screening. Each scrap of paper might hold code names, troop positions, or hints of morale. U.S. intelligence combed through these items for anything useful. Photographs of wives and children were sometimes tucked into bags of souvenirs, sometimes filed away and forgotten in military stores. For the prisoners, their capture was already devastating. The loss of family tokens deepened the isolation and shame. Meanwhile, conditions of captivity diverged sharply from the battlefields where hatred burned hottest. American military leadership, particularly after learning of atrocities committed against Allied POWs in places like Batoon, was determined to uphold Geneva Convention standards, if only to strengthen its own moral position. While far from perfect, U.S. camps for Japanese prisoners were generally clean, adequately fed, and supervised with discipline, but not gratuitous cruelty. The contrast was striking. Men who days earlier faced certain death on a Pacific beach now slept on bunks, received medical care, and were given the chance, however bitter, to live. Yet living was its own torment. The psychological collapse of captured Japanese soldiers was profound. Many refused to write home, unable to admit survival. Some destroyed or hid their names, fearing disgrace if their families learned of their fate. Silence ruled the barracks. Camaraderie often dissolved under the weight of shame. Guards sometimes described them as ghosts, men, physically present but inwardly shattered by mid-1944. As the U.S. advanced across the Central Pacific and the Mariana Islands fell, the number of captured Japanese slowly grew. Saipan alone produced several hundred POWs. Iwo Jima, long considered a fight-to-the-death fortress, unexpectedly yielded about 200 survivors. Each prisoner was a living contradiction. Soldier of an army sworn never to surrender, yet breathing in captivity. With every capture came more letters, diaries, and photos swept up by intelligence teams. These fragments of lives, wedding portraits, children's first school pictures, aging parents posed stiffly in formal dress, ended up in U.S. hands, stripped from pockets and rucksacks during searches. But as 1945 dawned, the war itself was shifting. The once unstoppable Japanese empire was unraveling. Allied submarines cut supply lines. B-29 bombers burned city after city. Okinawa fell in June with appalling casualties. In August came the unimaginable Hiroshima and Nagasaki, obliterated by atomic fire. And then, almost overnight, the imperial war machine ceased. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, Japan signed its surrender. Suddenly, thousands of Japanese servicemen were no longer enemies on scattered islands, but prisoners in American custody, bewildered, starving, beaten, but alive. The machinery of war that had consumed millions now faced a new question: how to handle these men as humans, not just enemies. It is at this pivot, surrender's echo rolling across oceans, that a small, almost accidental act of humanity began to take shape. The same photographs once taken for intelligence would soon reappear in unexpected hands. Japan's surrender created a vast and sudden shift in human geography. Ships that once carried troops and munitions now transported the defeated. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen, men who had survived jungles, atolls, and kamikaze missions, were collected and processed by Allied forces. In the Pacific, the United States ran the largest network of camps. From Hawaii to the U.S. mainland itself, many prisoners arrived in a state that stunned even battle-hardened guards. They were gaunt, malaria-ridden, still nursing untreated wounds. They carried almost nothing but the clothes they wore. The weapons and symbols of their cause had been stripped away. Swords, flags, and personal mementos taken for security checks. Often the only traces of home were tattered photographs. A wife in Tokyo, a father fishing on a distant coast, children smiling awkwardly in school uniforms. Some had hidden these deep in packs or boots, hoping they would survive battle. Many had been seized and placed in military intelligence stores. Just another piece of captured enemy material. The American system of handling POWs was not perfect, but was structured and deliberate. By 1945, the War Department had codified how camps should function. Food rations, equivalent to U.S. soldiers, organized barracks, medical inspections, limited recreation and work programs. While prejudice and suspicion lingered, most camps were calmer than the killing grounds of the Pacific, but psychological wounds ran deeper than physical deprivation. Japanese prisoners lived in silence, crushed under a cultural code that defined surrender as worse than death. Letters from home rarely arrived, and when they did, they could cut both ways. Some families wrote with cautious relief. Others expressed shame or refused contact altogether. The prisoners themselves often avoided writing back, unwilling to confess their status. Many clung to stoicism, but diaries from the time showed despair and self-hatred. Yet on the American side, something subtle was shifting. The end of active combat forced U.S. forces to reckon with their former enemy differently. The propaganda that painted Japanese soldiers as faceless fanatics began to soften when seen up close. They were young, exhausted, frightened. Guards and intelligence officers alike could not ignore that most of these men were conscripts. Fathers, sons, brothers, military intelligence teams, no longer racing against the clock for battlefield secrets, began to inventory the massive stores of captured enemy materials. Bundles of letters, diaries, and photographs had piled up. Some officers, moved by the sight of so many lost fragments of family life, started pushing to return harmless personal effects. The Geneva Conventions allowed personal property that wasn't militarily sensitive to be restored. Red Cross, Delegates also visited camps, documenting conditions and urging humane treatment. Their reports emphasized dignity and small gestures that could ease despair. Sometimes these visits triggered quiet but important policy changes, including reviewing and releasing non-intelligence personal items. In some camps, commanders made informal decisions to go further. They recognized that the war had left the Japanese soldier cut off not just physically but emotionally from everything familiar. Allowing a man to hold a photo of his wife or child, to reconnect with something human, might restore morale and order. In practical terms, calmer prisoners meant safer camps. But in moral terms, it was an act of decency, at a time when vengeance might have felt easier. By late 1945 and into 1946, shipments of personal effects were quietly moving. Military warehouses returned boxes of letters and photos, once confiscated during island sweeps. At first, it was ad hoc. An officer might open a file and see harmless family photos, then send them back with a prisoner convoy. But gradually, this small kindness became more organized. American guards began distributing sealed envelopes containing whatever had been cleared, snapshots, postcards, sometimes even tiny good luck charms. These were not grand diplomatic gestures. No cameras rolled, no speeches were made. But for the men inside the wire, it was profound. The war had stripped them of face and family. Now, suddenly, a photograph slipped back into their hands. For Japanese culture, where family honor is deeply tied to one's identity, this return meant more than nostalgia. It suggested that somewhere, even among enemies, a line of respect had survived the firestorms and beaches. Soon, small ripples of emotion spread across the camps. Guards, expecting indifference or suspicion, witnessed something rare. Hardened men quietly overcome. Tears quickly wiped away. The gesture didn't erase the war, but it fractured the dehumanization on both sides. These early returns set the stage for one of the war's most unexpected scenes. American soldiers handing back to their former enemies the very images they had once seized, and in doing so, momentarily restoring a sense of humanity neither side thought possible. War is rarely only about armies and maps. It is lived most painfully in the private worlds people carry with them, the faces, the names, the quiet memories. The story of Japanese POWs weeping over returned. Photographs unfolds through several deeply human angles. The human angle, a family on paper for a Japanese soldier. A small photograph was far more than an image. It was a thread tying him to home, to the world before the war. Many enlisted men left villages and fishing towns they might never see again. In their packs, tucked into wallets or sewn into inner pockets, they carried small black and white prints, a wife seated formally with hands folded, a baby swaddled for its first portrait, parents standing stiff in Sunday clothes. These photos survived saltwater, foxholes, monsoon rain. They were proof of a life worth defending and a reminder of duty, but also of love and longing. When the U.S. military confiscated personal effects, it was a rational step in intelligence and security. Yet, for the captured soldier, the loss of that single photo could feel like the erasure of his identity. It was as if the final connection to home had been cut, leaving him adrift, no longer a warrior, yet no longer the man who once belonged to someone waiting far away. The cultural angle, shame, silence, and the invisible wound Japanese military ethos magnified the emotional toll of losing such mementos. Surrender was already crushing. Families were taught to mourn captured sons as if they had died dishonorably. Soldiers feared disgrace more than death. To have one's photo taken or lost in the process of capture added another layer of humiliation. The intimate made foreign property. In camp life, this shame produced a distinct quiet. American guards often remarked that Japanese POWs were more reserved and withdrawn than German captives. They rarely sang or joked. Many spent hours sitting still, staring at the ground. The return of a photograph to such a man was not simply an act of kindness. It pierced a carefully maintained wall of stoicism. In Japanese culture, public tears, especially for soldiers, were rare and private grief was guarded. That some wept openly when photos were returned says much about the depth of emotion and the weight these small images carried. The American soldiers, angle, Enemies become fathers and sons, the American side. The gesture of returning photos changed perspectives too. For months, propaganda had portrayed Japanese soldiers as alien and merciless. Marines on Tarawa or Peleliu rarely glimpsed anything but hatred and defiance before a final, desperate charge. Yet in the quiet aftermath of victory, guards in POW camps encountered a different truth. The enemy was a hungry, tired young man barely older than themselves. Many U.S. servicemen were farmers' sons, factory workers, teachers, suddenly face to face with equally ordinary men once sworn to kill them. Distributing photos forced an unexpected confrontation with shared humanity. A guard might hand an envelope across the barbed wire and see the prisoner's face change shock, trembling, then something almost childlike in its vulnerability. For some Americans, this broke down years of hate. Veterans later recalled this moment as the first time they felt empathy toward the Japanese. It was a quiet but profound shift, a recognition that the war's dehumanization had been incomplete. Subtle impact on camp atmosphere. The emotional weight of these returns was not lost on camp leadership. Officers noticed that even a small restoration of personal dignity could calm restless or depressed prisoners. Camp reports mention improvements in morale and order after humane gestures, mail deliveries, restored keepsakes, or even the chance to write home. In the tense post-war months, when no one knew how defeated Japanese forces might react, these small actions helped keep the peace. The narrative of war usually ends with surrender and statistics. Yet here, a smaller and quieter reality was unfolding, one where human gestures began to rebuild fragments of identity among the defeated and thaw the hatred among the victors. It was only the beginning. Beyond this human and cultural dimension lay other forces shaping the story: intelligence decisions, Red Cross advocacy, and moral debates within the U.S. military about how far to extend empathy to a former enemy. The intelligence angle, sorting secrets from souls behind. Every returned photograph was a long chain of intelligence work. During the war, captured materials went first to field examiners who combed through everything: diaries, orders, notebooks, photographs for clues. Sometimes a smiling family picture was flipped over to reveal scribbled notes or hidden codes. Military intelligence could not risk missing such details. Every scrap was scanned, translated, cataloged, but once Japan surrendered, urgency drained from these files. Boxes filled with harmless, deeply personal items, no longer useful, no longer dangerous, remained in U.S. depots. Some intelligence officers began to see them not as evidence, but as human debris of war. Internal memos and post-war accounts show quiet initiatives. Lists compiled to reunite prisoners with confiscated property. Camp officers authorized to distribute cleared items. What started as a sterile bureaucratic process shifted toward something compassionate, though no one would have called it that then. Red Cross and humanitarian influence. Quiet pressure for dignity. Another subtle force was the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICR. Red Cross teams inspected U.S. camps, checking food, shelter, and medical care. Their presence often nudged military authorities to go beyond minimum compliance with the Geneva Conventions. Reports from late 1945 and 1946 recommended that harmless personal effects be returned to captives when possible, part of restoring moral welfare. These recommendations aligned with some commanders' instincts. If prisoners could be reminded of family and ordinary life, despair and violence might lessen. This wasn't just idealism, it was pragmatic security. But the humanitarian reasoning mattered. The Red Cross often became the bridge between wars, legal obligations, and moral action, quietly shaping policies that touched individual lives. Leadership angle, commanders, choosing decency. In several documented cases, local U.S. officers acted beyond mere compliance. Some camp commandants, often veterans themselves, felt the weight of holding former enemies. They understood discipline, but also recognized suffering. Accounts exist of commanders personally approving the handback of letters and family photos, sometimes against the caution of intelligence staff. These decisions were rarely dramatic. They happened in offices, on quiet afternoons, when war's rage was finally cooling, yet they mattered enormously. A single signature could allow a man to hold his child's picture again. These acts of leadership demonstrated that morality in war isn't always dictated by grand policy. Sometimes it's a quiet choice at a desk. The moral angle, the enemy's humanity, and one's own for both sides. The return of these photos carried a moral charge. For the Americans, it was a confrontation with their own propaganda and the temptation of vengeance. It asked young soldiers to recognize the humanity of those who had fought and sometimes killed their friends. It did not excuse atrocities or erase grief, but it reminded them of shared human identity. For Japanese POWs, it was more complex. The photo's return could reopen guilt I lived while others died. Yet it also broke isolation. It said, even in defeat, even branded a disgrace by one's own homeland, family still existed somewhere, and even an enemy soldier could see you as a man, not just a uniform. These intertwined moral awakenings didn't heal the wounds of the Pacific War, but they planted quiet seeds. Some veterans later spoke of this as their first step away from hatred. Some Japanese survivors, decades later, described that moment as the first time they felt seen since capture. Emotional ripples. How small gestures traveled through history. The act of returning a photograph seemed small, but its echo extended far beyond the camp fence. Some of the men who received those envelopes took them back across the sea when they were repatriated. They returned to shattered cities. Two families scattered or lost, yet clutching an image that had survived both war and captivity. Oral histories tell of men showing those pictures to grandchildren, explaining that an American guard had given it back. For families raised on tales of merciless enemies, this nuance mattered in the United States too. Stories traveled quietly. Guards wrote in letters home about the moment a Japanese prisoner cried over a child's face. Such stories complicated the easy narrative of us versus them. Over time, they joined the slow current of reconciliation that would reshape U.S.-Japan relations in the post-war decades. These angles, intelligence, pragmatism, turning humane, Red Cross influence, quiet moral choices by officers, and deeply personal ripples set the stage for the most vivid moment in this entire narrative. The dry work of sorting captured materials would lead to a scene few expected: enemies, now powerless and broken, meeting their past selves again through a single photograph. Next came the turning point, the moment when envelopes crossed the space between captor and captive, and silence broke at last. It happened quietly, without ceremony. By late autumn 1945, the first shipments of cleared personal effects had reached U.S. camps holding Japanese prisoners. Cardboard boxes labeled with camp codes and shipment numbers were unloaded and sorted by clerks, who had never seen battle but understood the weight of what they handled. Inside were hundreds of small envelopes, some with photographs, some with postcards or folded paper charms. In one camp in Hawaii, the routine of the day broke when guards ordered the prisoners to assemble. The men filed out silently, their straw sandals whispering across the packed earth. They expected another inspection, perhaps a work detail. Instead, they saw a long wooden table, and behind it, American soldiers with stacks of envelopes. A camp interpreter spoke briefly, haltingly. Personal belongings. Returned. If your name is called, step forward. The list began. A thin man in his 20s, a former naval conscript, stepped up first. He bowed, hand shaking as he accepted the envelope. The guard said nothing, only nodded once. The man opened it slowly. Inside was a single photograph. His parents and younger sister, standing outside their home before he left for war. The air seemed to leave his body. For a moment he stood frozen, then pressed the picture to his forehead and bowed low. When he straightened, his eyes were wet. Another man came forward, older, once an infantry sergeant on Saipan. His envelope contained a photo of a baby, his son, born after he sailed from Yokohama. He had never seen the child's face. The picture was already worn at the edges, fingerprinted and creased, but still clear. He stared for a long time, expression unreadable, before sitting back down, shoulders hunched. Silent tears sliding down sunburned cheeks. Then the sound began to spread, not loud sobbing, but the quiet, restrained crying of men trained never to show weakness. Some covered their faces. Others sat very still, tears falling onto dust. The Americans were stunned. Many had expected indifference or even suspicion. Instead, they were witnessing the collapse of barriers built through years of brutal fighting. For the first time, the Japanese soldiers looked simply like men, fathers, sons, brothers, each with a home they had thought forever lost. The guards did not interrupt. They simply continued the slow process of handing out envelopes. One GI later wrote to his parents, "It was the strangest sight. The same men we fought so hard to kill, now just men like us, looking at pictures of their kids." The act itself was small. Papers, photographs, a few ounces of weight returned, but it carried a force greater than any weapon. In a war defined by mutual dehumanization, this was a reversal, not of victory, but of blindness. The enemy regained a face, the captor a measure of compassion. There was no speech, no handshake, only silence broken by soft weeping and the low shuffle of prisoners returning to their quarters, holding something precious against their chests. Among the camp's American personnel, the scene left a lasting impression. Several officers noted it in after-action reports and personal journals, not as strategy, but as something more human. One Marine corporal wrote, "It was the first time I saw the war end." This moment was repeated, with variations. In other U.S. camps, some photographs had crossed entire oceans and bureaucracies before finding their owners. Others were smudged, torn, but still legible enough to bring men to their knees. And it was not only photographs. Some prisoners received prayer, amulets, lockets, even children's doodles. One camp in the Philippines recorded the return of a crumpled origami crane taken from a dead comrade's kit, but later traced to a living prisoner. The recipient broke down completely, clutching the fragile paper as if it were life itself. These scattered moments stitched together a quiet turning point. They did not rewrite history's violence, but they offered, in the midst of defeat, a glimmer of shared humanity. Yet the significance of these scenes did not end at the camp fence. The effect rippled outward, shaping how prisoners would remember their captivity, how Americans would interpret their victory, and how both nations would someday rebuild a shattered relationship. In the weeks that followed, word of these quiet returns moved through the camps like a whisper. Prisoners spoke softly to one another after lights out, sharing what had been restored. A man who once refused eye contact now passed around a creased photo of his village temple. Another, who had sat in silence for months, murmured a child's name aloud for the first time. These were not grand acts of reconciliation, but for men trained to expect only humiliation in defeat. Each photograph felt like the return of a lost self. Some American officers began to notice subtle changes. Where before there had been only detached obedience, there was now a fragile willingness to interact. Prisoners volunteered for work details, took part in camp classes, and, in rare cases, even practiced English. Guards who had kept their distance started seeing the men as something more than statistics. One intelligence sergeant wrote, "When they got their photos back, something broke open. They stopped looking like ghosts." This shift also fed back into policy. Reports up the chain noted improved morale and camp order after personal effects were returned. Fewer fights, fewer suicide attempts, fewer medical collapses from hopelessness. Some camps began actively requesting any unclassified belongings that might remain in intelligence stores. The process became a deliberate program rather than an accident, a quiet initiative driven less by command orders than by on-the-ground humanity. For many prisoners, the moment of reunion with a photo was intensely private but life-changing. Decades later, Japanese veterans gave oral histories describing this moment as one of the few mercies of captivity. One former soldier remembered, "They gave me the picture of my daughter. I had not seen her face. I thought I had lost everything, but there she was. It was like breathing again." Another spoke simply, "They let me be a father again." On the American side, the impact was more complex, but equally deep. These were the same men who, a year earlier, had seen their friends killed in savage fighting. They had carried images of their own families tucked under helmets and inside rucksacks. Handing a picture back to an enemy was like acknowledging a shared, painful mirror, the understanding that war had swallowed men who, under other circumstances, might have shared a meal or a joke. Some veterans said that this was the first time they felt their own hatred shift into something quieter. One Marine wrote decades later, "I didn't forgive what they'd done, but I realized they'd lost everything too. That picture could have been my kid." This moment also chipped at the monolithic image of the enemy back home. Letters from guards describing the scenes occasionally reached American newspapers or family conversations. Though not widely publicized, these accounts added small, human details to a war often told in sweeping numbers and horror. Meanwhile, the photographs themselves became quiet survivors of the war. Many were carried back to Japan when repatriations began in late 1946. Men stepping off ships into a ruined homeland clutched these pictures like lifelines. For some, the people in the photos were gone, lost to bombings or famine. But the image still carried proof they had once belonged somewhere beyond war. A few kept them in family altars. Some placed them in new homes, rebuilt from ashes, in rare but poignant cases. Former POWs reached out to Americans after the war. A few wrote letters of thanks, some decades later, acknowledging the gesture. One ex-soldier wrote to a camp guard who had given him back his wife's portrait, "You gave me back my reason to live." These exchanges were private, but each was a thread binding former enemies in a quiet, human way. The turning point created no treaties, no headlines. Yet it mattered, because it broke the chain of total hatred, if only slightly. It showed that even amid total war's wreckage, small decencies could survive and alter how the defeated and the victors saw each other. From here, the story moves outward to the wider consequences of this subtle humanity. Returning photographs may have seemed trivial at the time, but they influenced how Japanese POWs reintegrated into post-war life, how Americans thought about their former enemies, and how a devastated relationship between nations began, slowly and uncertainly, to mend. When the Great Repatriations began in late 1946, the U.S. military faced the task of sending tens of thousands of Japanese POWs home. The return was not triumphant. It was a long, weary passage across oceans, on Liberty ships and converted troop transports. Men who had left Japan as warriors now came back thin and subdued, some missing limbs, some haunted by sickness and defeat. But many carried one thing of deep personal value: the small paper tokens returned to them in captivity. The photographs traveled in pockets, tucked into shirts close to the heart, or stored carefully in folded cloth. They were among the few possessions that survived both war and imprisonment. Some men stepped onto Japanese soil with no shoes and no savings, but held fiercely to these fragile images. For many, homecoming was bittersweet. Cities like Tokyo, Yokohama, Hiroshima lay in ruins. Families were displaced, sometimes gone entirely. Bombing had flattened neighborhoods beyond recognition. Yet the photos provided proof of life before destruction. A thread back to the self that had existed before the war swallowed everything. One repatriated soldier wrote, "I walked into nothing, but I had her face. It kept me from being a ghost." The emotional effect was immediate. Survivors who had felt unworthy of returning found a reason to step forward. Some believed the photo itself had saved them, a quiet reminder of love that endured even when nations clashed. For widows and parents who greeted these returning men, the photographs were bittersweet too, a frozen image of happier days, now tinged with grief but still alive. In the broader Japanese society, the stigma of surrender lingered painfully. Former POWs were often marginalized, seen as dishonored, but the fact that some had their family images intact created small openings for families sometimes displayed the returned photo as a sign of connection rather than shame, proof their son or husband had clung to home despite the ordeal. These tokens could not erase defeat, but they softened alienation and helped rebuild identity. The U.S. military's decision to treat POWs humanely and, crucially, to return personal items also carried strategic implications. American planners understood that the occupation of Japan would require not just force, but legitimacy. Humane treatment of prisoners became a talking point in military circles. It stood in stark contrast to reports of Japanese brutality against Allied captives. Quiet acts of decency bolstered the United States' moral stance and made later cooperation, including rebuilding Japan's infrastructure and government, slightly less fraught, within America itself. These small moments filtered slowly into the veteran community. Men who had once sworn eternal hatred sometimes told their families about the day they gave back photos. They rarely romanticized it. The war's scars were too deep, but they acknowledged the humanity they'd glimpsed. These stories added subtle texture to the American memory of the Pacific War, which otherwise risked hardening into caricature and bitterness at the same time. Post-war historians began noticing the psychological impact of humane captivity. U.S. Army studies from the late 1940s recorded better long-term adjustment among Japanese POWs than expected. Many cited the return of personal property as part of that adaptation. It did not erase trauma, but it gave a small measure of dignity. Two men who had lost almost everything. Yet the story did not end with immediate repatriation. In the years to come, those fragile images handed across a camp table by a former enemy would reappear in unexpected places, on household altars, tucked into war memoirs, even shown to grandchildren curious about the past. They became quiet witnesses to a war that took so much but left a few strands of grace. The broader significance of these acts was still unfolding, shaping memory, relationships, and the moral aftermath of total war. In the decades after the war, Japan and the United States moved from sworn enemies to uneasy partners and, eventually, close allies. That transformation was shaped by grand forces, economics, geopolitics, occupation policy, but also by countless small, human threads. Among them were the quiet memories of former POWs who had experienced dignity at their lowest point. When historians interviewed repatriated soldiers in the 1960s and 1970s, a surprising number mentioned the return of personal items, not as a turning point in policy, but as a deeply personal act that softened their view of the Americans. One veteran, who later worked in U.S. jupe and trade, said simply, "I could trust after that. They treated me like a man." Another former sailor told his son, "We were enemies, but they gave me back my family." That mattered. These testimonies were often private, shared within families rather than in public forums, because surrender remained a delicate subject. Yet in their homes, survivors placed those same photos on family shrines beside tablets for the dead. Some were framed, others kept folded in drawers. A few were shown to grandchildren with quiet words, "This was returned to me by an American soldier." In those moments, history shifted from abstract hatred to lived nuance. In the U.S., the impact took a different form. Veterans who had witnessed or participated in the gesture sometimes returned home with a changed perspective. They spoke of it as one of the first times they felt the war truly ended, not at the formal surrender on the USS Missouri, but when an individual enemy's grief became visible. A number of these stories surfaced later in oral history projects, where old Marines and Army guards recalled the silent tears of men opening envelopes. "It was strange," one said, "to realize we'd spent years trying to kill people who had children just like ours." The moral influence of such small moments rippled upward. 2. U.S. military reports on POWs. Management fed into the post-war ethos of winning the peace. Occupation authorities sought to rebuild Japan in a way that would prevent future war. They understood that brutality would only harden resentment. Acts of basic humanity, even as minor as returning a photograph, supported the narrative that America sought a just peace, not endless vengeance. This mattered profoundly as the Cold War began and Japan became a crucial ally in Asia. Academically, the episode also forced reconsideration of wartime propaganda. In the 1980s and 1990s, scholars revisiting POW policies noted how easily combat had dehumanized opponents on both sides, yet also how small, deliberate gestures of recognition could counter that tide. Returning personal effects became a case study in the microethics of war, how individuals, not just states, shaped the moral aftermath. For the Japanese families who lost so much, the gesture sometimes provided an unexpected solace. Widows who received their husbands' belongings often learned that Americans had treated them with a degree of care unimaginable in the ferocious Pacific struggle. A few even reached out, decades later, to express gratitude. Such exchanges, though rare, built quiet bridges by the early 21st century. Museum exhibitions and oral histories began featuring these stories more openly. Photographs once hidden away appeared in displays about POW life, war memory, and reconciliation. In some cases, the exact photo returned in 1945 became an artifact, a fragile black and white print mounted under glass, its edges still bent from a soldier's trembling hands. None of this erased the Pacific War's horrors. The massacres, bombings, starvation, and cruelty were real and left scars that endure. But the return of something so intimate amid defeat proved that even total war cannot fully extinguish human decency. It showed that peace is often seeded not only by treaties and strategy, but by personal recognition. The small moment when one man sees another not as enemy, but as human. From those quiet barracks and weeping soldiers came a thread of understanding that, though invisible in the official record, helped carry two nations from annihilation toward an imperfect but enduring peace. The Pacific War ended with mushroom clouds and cities in ashes, but its quieter endings happened far from surrender decks and official proclamations. They unfolded in camp yards scattered across Hawaii, the Philippines, and the American mainland, places where the victors faced the vanquished, not as symbols, but as men. There, a simple photograph became a vessel for something greater than intelligence or war trophies. It held love, home, and the fragile self that war tries to erase. When U.S. guards handed back those small images, they were not rewriting the war's outcome, nor excusing its brutalities. They were acknowledging a truth war often tries to bury: the humanity of the enemy and, by extension, one's own. For the Japanese prisoners, this recognition pierced a silence heavier than chains. It reminded them that beneath defeat and dishonor, their lives still connected to family and memory. For the Americans, it punctured the myth of a faceless foe, revealing fathers, brothers, and sons, much like their own. In that exchange, paper for understanding. The idea of absolute hatred cracked out history tends to measure victory in miles gained and treaties signed. Yet the fragile peace between the United States and Japan was built not only by generals and diplomats, but also by small, unrecorded mercies. An envelope passed across a table, a soldier's quiet tears, a guard watching hatred soften. These were threads in a larger fabric of reconciliation. Even decades later, survivors kept those photographs as proof that war's fire cannot burn away every trace of compassion. Some placed them on family altars. Some showed them to grandchildren who could scarcely imagine the battlefields of Saipan or Okinawa. In that act of remembrance lay a silent hope that what was learned in those camps, the recognition of shared humanity, might outlast the violence that required it. In the end, the story of Japanese POWs weeping over returned family photos is not only about defeat or survival. It is about how, even after the most savage war, a single gesture of decency can echo for generations and help enemies begin the long journey back to being human again.